So welcome, everybody. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties because, this is about, I don't know, it might be ironic since this is about legislation. It might be, that's the reason I'm having so many problems. I had to shift from one computer to another. So I'm checking with, so Bev Herman, if you can just say that you can hear me, because I don't know if I'm being received.
I can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Bev. I appreciate it. I think the only thing you can see is the top of my, you can actually see the two documents that we're going to look at. So I'm just going to wait for a minute. I'll do the official welcome, and Beverly is going to be my right-hand woman. She'll correct me when I'm off base or something like that. So I'm just going to stop sharing and just for a minute, and then I'll be back. So just as a prelude to our meeting, I just thought I would share some really wonderful things that I've seen recently. I was down in San Juan, and so I know Brenda Whitehorse is with us, and saw a wonderful class in Navajo, and some of the best math classes I've probably ever seen at middle school and elementary, where they were working on word problems. So the reason I bring up these, really key indicators of success in Utah is to make sure that we, really continue in our advocacy for every single student. I went to another school, I won't actually say which one. And so, typically I ask the student, what are you learning today? Why are you learning it? And how will you know that you've learned it? And I think this was an 8th grade student. So I'm getting reminders. You can see all my reminders there. Sorry about that. Okay, I apologize for that. This is a different computer. This is a work computer that I just received. So when I asked the student, and I think he was an 8th grader, might have been a 7th grader because it was a 7th, 8th grade class. And I said, what are you learning today? Why are you learning it? And, how will you know that you learned it? So the student thoughtfully, paused for a minute, looked at me and said, well, we're not really learning anything. We're doing worksheets, which I thought was kind of an interesting insight from a student. And the reason I'm bringing that up is, in observations at the district level, the tendency is not to do that because principals and vice principals do that. But I think it's a wonderful experience for people at the district level to actually visit schools and interview students and then just gather that data. And I think it's very enlightening. And when I talk to students, I always say to them, I visit lots of schools and the most important and classrooms. And one of the most important things is to better understand what the student is experiencing about his or her education. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, and thank you for being patient and being with me, and this is being recorded. So, that's really valuable. And I just want to make clear that this is not an ALS issue. This is for every single LEA and every single educator in the entire state of Utah, because now it's state law. Previously, many of these things, but not as specifically, were covered in civil rights legislation and in, the Department of Justice and the Department of Education joint letter around ensuring quality education for students learning English. So for me, the issue is we're kind of going to be the advocates. Recently, when people tend to be confused, they'll come to the federal programs person and ask about enrollment, or they'll ask about, translation services, or they'll ask about, other issues that impact all the schools. So I'm saying this because the important role that ALS directors and your connection with Title I programs, because Title III accountability is in Title I, I think is really important. And I just want to invite you to, I have a strange kind of small computer. So I'm not gonna monitor the chat really. So the big thing would be for you just to come off chat and ask questions, and Bev and I will address them. The reason I'm including Bev is that she was there. Both of us worked on the bill, but she was there through kind of thick and thin and went over. She probably knows the legislation word for word even better than I do. So there are two pieces that are important. We're going to do the kind of the easiest one first, and I just took directly from the legislation the things that would be the most relevant for this meeting at the present. This legislation 230 was also sponsored by Representative Dan Johnson. I think it's Dan R. Johnson, and then Senator Thatcher. So I also want you to know that these two pieces of legislation, when and I think Bev was there when she gave testimony, and then there was a refugee student who had been, I think, evacuated from Afghanistan. And so the issues about enrollment are really critical. And recently on the USBE Aspire, working with the tech team, we actually put the exact wording from this legislation into Aspire. Previously, it was birth certificate at enrollment and then a slash, and it was official document. And people were assuming that, you could make judgments about official documents, but mostly everybody thought it needed to be the birth certificate. And if it wasn't the birth certificate, then the student either couldn't be enrolled or there were questions related to the student, even if they had been Ukrainian or an Afghan refugee during the evacuation. So then we found out that there was lots of confusion. I got lots of emails. So thanks people who emailed me. You were my lifeline to the real world. And we got it fixed. So now Aspire has birth certificate and then it has the list from this legislation. The other thing in this legislation is that this year we'll be working on a policy that will come from the board. And I'll probably depend on all of you to support that effort.
Krista,
yes.
can I ask, are you wanting to show, it sounds like you're referencing things, but all we're seeing is just your monitor screen?
Yeah, I'm not gonna, I was just doing that as a way of introduction, but thank you.
Okay, just checking.
And the only way I can share is if I actually see my screen. So you tell me. So I'm opening up the, can you see this, Bev?
Yep, now we can see the text.
Okay, good. So if you see, this was interesting because, and Bev can attest to this, these were unanimous votes in the Senate subcommittee and the representatives subcommittee, and then actually on the whole floor. It's very rare that legislation has a unanimous vote. And if you look at the sponsors, I mean, we had quite a few sponsors. Dan and Johnson was a chief sponsor, and then we had all these co-sponsors. So this is the reason I put this up here. This is really important to know that the state legislature has really clearly understood the implications of refugee situations and the children coming in for Utah's protection. So if you look at the highlights, I'm not going to read it to you, but again, it is really about enrollment. And the purpose is if there is an issue about a student's birth certificate, or if the student's birth certificate does not accurately reflect a student's age. Working with refugee students, and Bev, you can chime in here, there ends up being really difficulty when students are in refugee camps or they've been, evacuated because of war, and they have sponsor families in Utah that are gracious enough to welcome them into Utah. And the issue about the actual birth of a student. So Bev, do you want to say anything about this? Because I know you have some experience related to the difficulty with birth certificates.
Yeah, so we've had quite a few instances where either families weren't able to bring birth certificates with them. Oftentimes they're in a lot of different countries. Birth certificates are just not a thing. They don't issue birth certificates, right? And we've also had a couple of instances where, especially with a couple of our students from Afghanistan, where they literally have gotten kind of shuffled onto a plane, helping others get to the airport, and they rolled through the line and someone said, "How old are you?" And it got interpreted as, or "When is your birth date?" And it got translated or interpreted as, "How old are you?" The kid said 12 or 13. So they put down 1/1 of 2013, which meant the child was supposed to be going into third grade. When the family came to our elementary school, it was quite clear that this young man with a mustache, full facial hair, everything, was not a third grader. But there was really no way of, because we didn't have any other documentation. So it was really a timely issue for us, at least here in Canyons. And we've already kind of instituted some of these things, but are still working on fine tuning what this really looks like for schools, especially high schools, when they're registering. So.
Thanks, Bev. I think it's always really important to have a real life experience instead of it being theoretical and legislative. I mean, this is one of the few times it seems to me that legislation is really heartfelt and has been influenced by the actual experience of refugees coming into the state of Utah. If you look at the definition, let's see, Jared, could you make Bev co-host? I don't know if you can or not.
Yeah, I'll look. Hold on.
Okay, because there's something in the chat, and I don't know if you were co-host that you can actually look at it, Bev, because I'm not going to be going back and forth on the computer to look at the chat.
I can see the chat, and it just says I-94. That's all it says in there.
Yeah, well, I think you have to be careful about the I-94
Yep.
for lots of reasons. Okay, so Bev, do you want to talk about the, in the refugee collaborative, part of the problem with UTREX and understanding refugee issues is putting blanket things in like I-94. So Bev, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, so I-94 is one of those tools that we can use in the absence of a birth certificate. However, we have had multiple I-94s come through and actually have worked with IRC and Department of Homeland Security to try to get some of those fixed. We've had, a lot of our students are 1/1 of whatever year. But like I said, the same issue with I-94, even when a family is coming through all of the channels where we're getting I-94s and all of these things, again, families in many cultures, they don't have birth certificates. So it's based on religious holidays. And so they kind of can estimate, but sometimes the birth dates are still wrong. We've been working with a family that had 3 of their 5 children, based on immunization records showing that they got immunizations in certain years, meant that their I-94 was incorrect. And so it's taken about 2 years, and we still have not fixed those I-94. So that was because there were a lot of people said, well, we'll just go off of the I-94 because it took about 2 years as we were working through this legislation. And fortunately, there were some real life experiences, not just by myself, but by other people working with our youth, and similar experiences. So I-94 can be one, but they're also not always accurate.
Yeah, and one of the ways that this legislation mitigates that is when we actually go down the bill, you'll see, multiple multiple ways in which you create an environment for students to be welcomed in Utah without it being so legalistic and depending on one source is what this legislation is trying to do. The other thing I think is interesting is that the definition that's the most relevant. The other issue is, and now I'm thinking about this, Bev, that we probably should do a special recording for registrars because this ends up being like a gigantic issue with school registrars, elementary all the way through high school. And part of the issue ends up being the different student data systems that are being used by, you know, which is interesting. So Melinda Lamott has raised her hand. I'll just, you can speak, but let me just do one thing in relationship to the definition, Melinda. You see the definition of the newcomer student. Now, this is an important definition, and the reason it's an important definition is it's determined by the date when the student comes into our school. And that's the way this is phrased, which is immigrant. You cannot ask a student, and no field, I'm just being very clear, no field in any data system can have the word immigrant. That is against federal law. It's against civil rights law. You cannot ask about any kind of immigration status for enrollment into public schools. So it says a student who is 3 through 21 years old, was not born in any state, and has not attended one or more schools in one or more states for more than 3 full academic years. Now, the reason this is important, this is how we determine funding in Title III for increased percentages of immigrant students coming into the school system. And probably most of you will be surprised. The cutoff is $10,000 in relationship to significant increase. And the districts that actually get immigrant funding are Alpine, Granite, Canyons, and Provo. So I'm saying this because sometimes our assumptions about our colleagues and about certain districts don't really represent what's happening. So Melinda, if you could just
Sure. I just had a comment about, you mentioned the registration process, and this has actually come to light in our district, where our parent liaison was helping some families to register. We've had an influx of families from Peru, and several of them have taken pictures of their documents, brought them through, and then our system is set up that they have to have a physical copy of a birth certificate and enter that they've seen this. And so we've had to share the new law, and they said, well, how come nobody else told us? So you're right, as advocates, that we're spreading this message, and kudos to my district team for working hard and fixing our registration process, communicating with secretaries. And it all started with our parent liaison saying, well, actually, this can count as proof of birth to have a picture of the birth certificate as documented as instead of a birth certificate, other reliable proof. And so now our system has changed. Instead of saw birth certificate, it says or other reliable proof. And now we have a spot to put that in. And I just think it's great. It's moving towards the right direction to get these kids in school and registered according to the law.
So Melinda, if you don't mind, do you want to say which district? Because I don't.
Oh, sure. Sorry, I'm from Cache County School District.
Yay, Cache County. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think that's the other issue is this legislation was just passed after, as Bev said, 2 years with a lot of thought and, you know, kind of really being advocates for students coming in. So, and, you know, during the registration period, we did get a lot of questions. We've been working on the model policy as well, which is for the other legislation. But this legislation also, I think, really shapes how you can think differently about what enrollment happens instead of just a separate registrar at a desk looking at one document. And there are 4 things in the chat. Bev, do you want to look at that?
Sorry, I was just waiting for a good time. So Robin from Murray asked if we have procedures for SLIFE students. For example, a student's birthday places them in 9th grade, that they've not been in school for 3 years. Do you register for age, or do you have a process to honor a parent request for a lower grade? This has been a huge topic in our district. And so, and it's come up frequently over the years, but this year, the last 6 to 9 months has been, very all the time. And so I'm, Christelle knows this, I'm very big into show me the code, show me where it is. Let's make sure we've interpreted this correctly.
Right.
So I went to Christelle, who then contacted Brian Quisenberry, the Assistant Attorney General. There is no, so age appropriate is actually not in code. It is not, and that's the way it seemed to have been presented, was this is law, you must enroll age appropriate. So there's nothing really that says that, according to the Assistant Attorney General. Am I correct, Christelle? Okay. So what we have done is we have put together sort of, we've kind of gone through all of our enrollment manuals and things like that. So Robin, the answer is yes, sort of. We've put in a policy, but it's still being revised and kind of it's really difficult to put a step-by-step process of how this works, because we're taking it case by case. So we have students that have come in, and of course we know compulsory education and things like are different in every country. So we really are trying to create a team of people, myself included, from the district level, the school principals, the counselor, and we're really trying to look at this whole kid and say, okay, they're really 10th grade age appropriate, but they haven't been in school for a year. They really want to graduate with a diploma. We kind of look at everything and say, okay, let's start in 9th grade and just follow through, so that we can look at it like that. Now, what we're not going to do is, take a student that is, 12th grade age appropriate, but has not been in school the last 6 years, and suddenly put them in 8th or 9th grade, right? So we really try to look at the whole situation, the whole experience. We work a lot with the families. We've been working a lot with the kids. What are your goals? What is it you're wanting to do to try to get to place them in the correct grade? So yes, so I guess the question is no, we don't register for age, but what we kind of came to the conclusion of is that really we're talking about a handful of kids every year. So in 95% of all of our enrollments, age appropriate is going to be the placement, the suggested placement. And it's really these students with really unique situations, especially coming, from coming internationally. So Robin, did that answer your question? Oh, and then credits, sorry, you asked one more about credits for graduation. I spend a lot of time every week. That's part of my job, is reviewing international transcripts, which is also part of this bill as well, which has not been addressed yet. We're trying to create a repository so that as we're all spending our time reviewing transcripts and compulsory education, and how many credits should this be from Brazil, and we can start consolidating those with recommendations so that we can start trying to create a system across Utah. But the international transcripts are generally coming through me, and yes, I do take pictures from refugee camps as documentation. And then we are working together with our principals and the counselors and our registrars to make sure that appropriate credit is given and that consideration is given for differences in educational systems. I don't know if anyone else has this, but we have, in a lot of our policy, it's very black and white, and in our worlds, it's very, very gray. And there was for a while a belief that you could not issue more than 8 credits in any given year. Well, that's just not the way school works in some countries. So we've started shifting that narrative a little bit here, but it's not a clean, here's our policy and this is how it happens for every student. We're finding it's very, very difficult to put in place a step 1, step 2, step 3 for this situation. So it becomes a team approach involving lots of people at the school, parents, and the kids.
So, and thank you so much, Beverly. You know, I think one of the things that I would benefit from, and I'm hoping others would too, is if in the future, Christelle, we could talk about some of those scenarios and then be able to just even kind of think about the nuances and what might be in the best interest of kids, because I do feel like all of the exceptions we're encountering, each one of them is very, very unique. And one more question I would have for you, Bev, is just if let's just say, for instance, we have a 17-year-old student who's coming to us, who's female. She's come from a country where she's not been allowed to be a part of the education system. I'm a little reluctant to tell her she has to be a 12th grader, knowing that then she's going to go straight into adult ed and not have a chance to really have that experience. So if the request from the parent or the conversation were centered on perhaps starting her in 9th or 10th grade, is that one that is viable? Is it legal? Is it the right thing to do? Or, I mean, where would you go with that? Because I did see one of those right at the beginning of the year with a 17-year-old student who had 0 education as far as advanced for any kind of credits.
And that's where we are really trying to work with parents, students, because that is a really tough situation, right? Because I'm going to have a 17-year-old who's going to, potentially be 18 in a grade level with maybe kids that are just turning 13, or, you know what I mean? So we're trying to so I guess legally, is it legal? Yes.
It's legal.
You will lose, and then there's a, with per pupil funding at a certain point, then that student is not going to be eligible for that, which is far down on the list, but still worth talking, because that is something that your business administrators are going to be looking at. Right. And so there's no beautifully wrapped answer to this. In some of the cases, the kids are like, look, I want to get some English for a couple of years before I have to go out into the workforce or whatever. And we might put them in 11th grade and we work with the counselor. What I'm trying to push with students, especially in scenarios like this, Robin, we want to engage them in our culture and our community and our educational system, and hopefully cause them to love education so much they want to keep going, right? So we look at their goals, we look at what's happening, we look at what their parents are, and then we try making the best decision for that kid.
So I think it was this meeting previously, but somebody shared a really awesome document that gave examples of transcripts from different countries around the world and how to read those. Do any of you have access to that again? Because I've not been able to find it since. I know I popped it open. I loved it. I've told my team about it, and then I've not found it since.
So is
it.
that the one where we
Yeah.
had the one that we did? Yeah.
It's on our website.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And what would be helpful though, is because I would love to even create a little subcommittee, because sometimes I just get stuck, because depending on the country, if it's public or private, and then even within like a country such as Brazil, there are different public-private entities here and there that have different things. It would be nice to be able to say, okay, I've got this transcript, I don't know where to go with it. What are you guys thinking?
Okay.
So.
One
Yeah.
more thing I would suggest for the health and well-being of the whole group, as well as especially our students and their families, is that I'm a small district. We have 6,000 students. We have only one high school. We have 2 junior high schools. And there's been in the past just a lot of independent contractors making decisions about students. And so I had a conversation, given a directive, but needed to do it again. And basically what it said was that a counselor, a secretary, a principal cannot make these decisions in isolation. And I found a case where it really had been made, the decision between a registrar and a counselor for a student. The problem with that, and what I put forth as a directive, is that we needed to have myself, a student services director, we needed to make sure that we sat with the parent, and then we would speak with the principal of the school. But and we also are now requiring that we have a translator. And here's why, is that we had circumstances where a very well-meaning counselor took a look at things and was like, well, your student should be in 9th grade, but doesn't have schooling, isn't able to read. So therefore, I think it's best for your student to be in 7th grade. And come to find out, when we had a translator there, when we asked the dad what his wishes were, what he had intended, he was actually distraught that his student would not, or his child would not be able to take driver's ed. He wouldn't be able to take any of the work courses. He really, because of their circumstances, he actually wanted his child to be at the age appropriate grade, which was 9th grade. And really what he said to us that was alarming is that he just, because he's not educated himself, he trusted our school system to make the best decisions, and he didn't really understand our American system. So it was very problematic after the fact to be sitting with the dad and knowing that wasn't even his intentions and wishes, and really to have that team talk about what do you see as the future for your child and where would you like him to be, was just super important to have that with people who can be more consistent, I think, too, with parents in having those conversations.
Yeah, I think that's the other issue, and you'll see in this legislation about a team that should be meeting, right? And it gives you options. The repository, I didn't really put in here because the other model policy is like so intense, but it's related. So I think a subcommittee, and the other thing is, even though I'm hesitant to say it, I actually think, well, Dan Johnson and IRC have asked me what bills we want to work on. So I think probably a subgroup of us should talk about case studies and other issues, because that's the other thing. Yes, counselors are well-meaning, and if they don't have direction, and if there's a decision made by a registrar, which just happened, I hate to say it, like within the last month, there was, pretty not very happy situation with a sponsor family with Ukrainian children. So I think there's lots of confusion, and even adding sponsor families into the mix is even more challenging for lots of reasons. So I think the people, and I'll send this out to everybody and just say, if you're interested in being, more intensely involved with a subcommittee, that we should meet, because these issues for the last 6 years, the same questions have come up, and Brian and I have dealt with them like over and over and over and over again. And so let's go through. We have another question from Katina. We actually have 10 things in the chat. So I don't know, we might not even get through the model policy issue, which is fine. So
it's a hot topic that I think we're talking about right now. It's something that we're seeing. I just had a quick question, in the sense that the conversation about parents bringing children and wanting to have a different grade than supposedly they're supposed to be in. It comes down even to the elementary level. I know you guys are talking about high school, but I'm in elementary school, and I earlier this school year had a family come in, and it was really about, I want my daughter in 5th grade again, even though she should be in 7th, because I don't want her separated from her brother because of the trauma that they've experienced. The children didn't want to be apart. So I didn't know what you guys are talking about now. And I was sticking to, oh my gosh, but she's supposed to be in 7th. That was my mentality. So I really, really appreciate this conversation, because I wish I had this knowledge, 2 months ago, kind of thing. Or at least the clarity of this conversation a while ago, because we have a lot of students that are coming in, and based on the situations that they're in, it's quite a lot. It's not just about where do you fit into our system, but how do we best serve you? How do we best, help you so that you could be successful? Not just how do we make you fit into our mold? So I appreciate the conversation, and I would echo the fact that I think we should talk about this a little bit more often. It's real. It's just something that it's happening everywhere to some degree, not just in the older students, but even with the very young students. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
And
Hey,
Katina,
Christelle.
go ahead.
Oh, can I just add something? This is David from Granite School District, but we're now trying to get our folks, because we're large in number, to use the systems that we have in place, right? And that's what I heard Bev say is basically talk about the MTSS system, the student support system that everyone should have in place and probably does have in place. And so now we're having our compliance coaches and our academic coaches, which fortunately we have enough money to do that. Thank you to Max and Christelle for sending us that large amount of money that we're able to hopefully do some good things with. But we're trying to get people to use the systems that we have in place, right? And that's where we're going. And same with the retaining students and advancing students. We have a system in place for every student in our district, whether they come from this country, that country, wherever, where we do exactly what Bev and Katina were talking about, even Robin, we're to put a team together, help people with the nuances, but we're trying here to get people to start to use the systems that we already have in place with some nuances, right, that they may not come about, but that's where we're at in Granite with such large numbers. And we'd love to be part of the subcommittee for looking at ways to help refugee kids.
Thanks, Dave. Bev, there are like 10 other comments. And
Yeah, I
mean-
think most of the chat is we're caught up on. The only other question that we're not is how will you handle it if you don't get transcripts or information from other countries? That again is addressed to some extent in the bill, and we're again working through this, but we're really trying to, again, that team is establishing, tell us what happened, when you went to school, tell me about this. I had a young man from Lebanon, school had been demolished, had been bombed. There were no records left to be obtained. We talked to the kid about his schooling, and we interviewed him and we interviewed his family, and we tried doing our best to, award credits. Of course, that comes down to the principal approval based on the topics that he covered. And he was very successful, ended up graduating and is in university now. So he really, they know, you can tell a lot of times, like, did you really take chemistry? Well, tell me what you learned. It's not quite as simple as that, but we do the best we can with what we have. And then I also think, to Katina's point, that's one of the reasons why we really involve, or to Katina's question, we really involve the parents, because sometimes we know we want parents that want to keep their kids together. And sometimes we do have to explain that this may not be the best place, to have your 7th or 8th grader with your 5th grader, because now we're taking, we also want to look at moving forward if they're with their peer group. And so we really have all of these conversations with the parents, so they really understand how the decisions have a ripple effect moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Bev. In the chat, are there other questions before we go to supporting documents?
No, there's more comments, thank yous, and we've attached things here. I don't see any other questions that we haven't addressed.
Okay, good. Yeah, when I send this out with all the recording, I'll send an invitation for us to have we don't care how big the subgroup is, when people talk about subgroups, it's interesting. It's not going to be a small group because we need all these different perspectives. And what we would do to design something that would make a significant difference with counselors and registrars, right? And administration, obviously. So here's an example that's now in our Aspire system. So it says supporting documentation described may include, and this is a huge list. And if you look at it, it's an entry in a family religious text, adoption records, documentation from a social service provider. So these are all examples just to get clear about, you know, when there are these documents to help better understand what biological age the student is. But remember, that's not a requirement for placing students. So you have to be really clear about that. This part is important because it says, what if, right? Now, remember, this is in the law. This is in state law. We're not going to, this is not an exception. When a document is not available, the school shall assign a review team. And this is what, you know, Bev is talking about, to work with the enroller, the parent, to determine the student's biological age for an LEA to use for a student's enrollment in appropriate placement in a public school. Okay, so the key thing is what Bev is talking about. It's the appropriate placement in public school that will benefit the child, right? Based on the experience you're having with the family and the child. So the review team may include an appropriate district administrators, students, teachers, principal, counselor, social worker, psychologist, a culturally competent and trauma-informed community representative. Now, from my viewpoint, I think the cases that we've heard, if we were in those situations, we would need someone who actually understood, you know, what we had gone through, like the young man from Lebanon. Someone who, you know, is from Afghanistan and was dragged on a plane with no papers. Yeah, I mean, you know, that actually, this is our world. I mean, this is what happens. A school nurse or a health specialist, an interpreter, and it says, if necessary. When we look at the model policy, this is pretty much mandated. If there is a family that doesn't understand English, you are mandated to make sure that there is an interpreter and translator. And this is piece I think is really interesting is shall include at least 3 members, at least one of which has completed the instruction. And I looked up this instruction, and this is about child sexual abuse prevention and reporting obligations for no more than 2 years. And if you look at it, it says shall include, right?
And Christelle, we've had a request. I don't know if this was the document that was attached or if it was the actual bill text, but will you, when you send out the recording, will you send out the overview that you're looking at right now?
Yes.
Because it is really nice and clear.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll send, yeah, no, I sent the bill text out, but yesterday I thought to myself, well, this is too confusing. And there are parts of the bill that really refer to like people that I don't really have any connection to actually, but I will probably because it's counselors and registrars and, you know, the repository and the data people and all of that. And I'll send this one because it is easier to understand along with the bill. Now, the reason this is really important is this section about, in addition to any duty to comply with mandatory reporting requirements, a school shall report to local law enforcement any sign of child trafficking that the review team identifies in carrying out the review team's duties. Now, I think you all know, I had a special session with a trafficking specialist. And I know David, and David, you can talk about this too, because I know you actually have someone, I think, who really focuses on this. But the issue of and it was recorded. So I'll send you the link to the recording for the trafficking, even though it's really often very hard to, you know, I mean, our role is to understand it and understand what we should be looking for. It's not to be judging people, right? So I think that piece is really challenging. I don't know, Dave, do you want to say anything about this section about trafficking? Well, he might not be there. Okay, are there?
Sorry, this is Shannon Stapert from Granite also. Dave had to step away. I can say something if you'd like me to, if you give me a little more, because I work with Melanie, our H-type person as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, Shannon. Thanks for being on.
Yeah, she has been actually to all 90 of our schools and met with with administration and counselors and registrars there, and just has given them like indicators to look for and things. And she also meets with all of our teams at the district level. So as we go out and work in schools, if we see warning signs, we can do that too. But I know that our refugee students are often more likely to be sexually trafficked or human trafficking than just our general population. They're a very susceptible population.
Sorry, Christelle, I had to step away. I don't know what the question was, but if anyone needs help with, because I know that 3 Strands is the group that has been approved to work with on their curriculum for students, as well as protocols that they've come up with our district. And we're happy to help anyone or have you take a look at those curriculum. And so just let us know how we can help. This is our 3rd year in a demonstration grant from the federal government. And so happy to help however when it comes to human trafficking.
Thanks, Dave. I really appreciate that. So, Bev, do you see any other questions?
No, they're all just comments that, like, Dave had to step away, etc. So you're good.
Okay, so can you all see the model policy, or you cannot see it?
We can't see it.
Okay, so let me see if I can get back on. Let's see. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Just not the policy. Yep, there we go.
Okay, great. Okay, this is much longer, and we have to send it. So it's gone through lots of variations. The other thing is that it's called a model language access plan. And the requirement is now that every district has a model language access plan. And this reinforces everything that we've just talked about in relationship to engaging family. I can do a summary of the bill like I did for the last one, so you can actually understand the whole context of the bill. This is like one portion of it that's really critical. And we've had lots of revisions, and Bev has really helped me on this because she was integral in that. And we have an education interim report that we're working on that we have to send to the committee next week. So this is almost the final one. And the thing that's interesting about this is this is really about state purchasing related to translation and interpretation services. So one of the big things I think that's really important, and Bev, you can chime in here before we start, is when you look at the state purchasing contracts that are available, Bev, we found that there were 3, I think, and then 3 for sign language or something.
Yeah, so we found some. It's really confusing because some are in person only, some are only over the phone, and then they were all mixed in with sign language interpreting. So there was no clear delineation between what was actual translation or interpreting and translation of different languages versus sign language. It was really confusing.
Yeah. Now the reason this is important is that the bill is actually requesting all of us, LEAs, to give feedback to the state purchasing agents about what they can do to better support the needs of LEAs, which hasn't ever happened before, right? It just hasn't happened. So this bill is like, in some ways, revolutionary because it's very clear that there should be other mechanisms by which districts, and Ogden, many districts are a good example of this because the state purchasing contracts don't really meet their needs and it's really confusing, right? So this is an opportunity for us to be able to give recommendations. And there actually is a section in the report that I've asked the state purchasing people to complete. But I think Bev and I will probably work on some recommendations, and you can send us recommendations about how the state purchasing should respond to LEAs. Would be really great, because it would be coming from us, right? It'd be coming from the people who are actually using or not using. The other section in the bill says something like and it's shall, so it's not, if they want to, but it's on the use and the effectiveness of the contracts that are available. So do you see why that's important? Because the whole focus is, if the LEAs need this, then why can't we actually respond to that through contracts, through state purchasing? And I know they've talked about, Nick, who is really an interesting guy, about, determining what has been effective and what's been used and what's not, because there are some contracts that aren't used at all. And yet their expiration date is, 2025 or something like that. So I think it gives us a good opportunity. So we're not going to really talk about that so much, but if you have recommendations about how state purchasing can be more responsive, when I send the recording and everything else out, you should send it to me. And then Bev and I'll get together and put it in the actual report for the state legislators. So this is a model policy, and the model policy is based on the legislation, right? Obviously. And the reason it's a model policy and not a board policy, frankly, is because we want you to look at the legislation and then look at your situation, right? Look at your own context. And yes, it's a model policy, and there are things that are required, right? But it's not a board policy, which I think makes a model policy, it ends up being more yours, right? Even though it's based on the law. Okay, so here's the guidance statements. And it's quite a bit. I'm not going to go over anything, but I'm just going to give you time to look at LEA, and I'll just start with the first one. LEA administrators should ensure that educators and staff comply with the LEA created, right? So you all have control over this. That's why it's so important, because then it's more easily implemented. Just like Dave was talking about, the people who go out and help principals and administrators to better understand the issues with trafficking. Policy written after consideration of the USBE model policy. So this is really, the key is that, and I'll just say it very generally, it is not only a civil rights obligation that OCR has actually used to investigate schools and districts in Utah, but meaningful communication to parents who speak another language other than English. That is our obligation. Just very simple. And now we have state law that says exactly the same thing. It's the whole idea of what parent engagement really looks like. Is it parent engagement for just a certain few parents, or is it parent engagement for all of our Utah parents who are now with us? So do you have any questions for that before we go on to the simple purpose? And so this will give you guidelines and how to develop that policy. And if you notice in the Title III self-assessment, there's a section that talks about this already. And it doesn't mean that you should have the policy in place like instantly. I mean, the point is to collaborate and to use this as a tool to actually educate your colleagues and schools and registrars and counselors about the necessity for engaging families who speak another language other than English. That's really the whole point. In some ways, it's kind of redundant since this happened in 1963. But my hunch is that we're probably one of the few states that has such a brilliant piece of legislation, thanks to the people who worked on it. So are there questions before we go on?
Yeah, Christelle, where do we obtain this document?
Oh, I sent out, I actually sent
Is it in
out,
the email?
yeah, I did, but the best thing to do is to wait until next week because
Oh,
I want to actually give you the final version that we're submitting to the Senate Interim Education Committee. So we've done like
thank you.
on our website. So here's a big thing on our website now, Title III USBE. You'll actually see the process that we use, like everybody who was involved in developing everything, because that's what the legislation demands, that we have an advisory procurement council with parents who are learning English. So we have a wonderful Afghani woman who asked really challenging questions the last time we met. And then we have, a doctor who's a postdoc at the University of Utah, whose son is at East, and his son is learning English. So if you go to Title III USBE, you'll see a new page that says legislation, and that will track everything that we've done so far. And then I'll update it with all these documents. So when you go to Title III, you'll see at the top, you'll see legislation. I think it's the last one. And you can click on it. It'll have the audio recording for our advisory council meeting, which was brilliant. Actually, we had this amazing conversation, and a lot of the recommendations were put into the new policy. And then we have all the languages that are spoken in every single LEA, which is required by the law. And then we'll have a brief overview of the executive summary. And then the final model policy will be there. So it'll be all available for you on the USBE Title III website under legislation. Does that help, Floyd?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that very much.
Well, thank you so much for asking the question. Any other questions before? So the first part is really about the guidance for every LEA. And it doesn't mean just the LEAs that are on this meeting. It actually means every LEA, right? So it's every charter school in every district.
Hey, Christelle, a point of learning for all of us. I actually have been corrected before for calling somebody an Afghani. That's actually their unit of money.
Oh, great.
They are Afghans.
Afghans, great, thank you.
And Christelle, I'm stepping away just for a minute, so then I'll come back and check the chat. Right?
Okay. So Robin, we did an audio of the meeting, so I think you'll find it really interesting. The Afghan woman was, her points and her questions and her concerns were just, really incredible. So here's the purpose. Has prepared a model language plan regarding access. So this is the point. Regarding access to agency services, programs, activities for persons who have limited English proficiency and understand other languages other than English. This model access plan is mandated by HB 302. And then there's a direct link. So then you'll actually have the text of the legislation. Okay. Here are the definitions. Pretty much all of you know what these mean. Primary language is first language spoken by the student and a student's parent or guardian. Now, the reason this is important, sometimes there's huge misidentification of students for EL services on the home language survey. They'll put that they're speaking a different language, but the student has always spoken English, but understands the language at home or speaks it at home. But that is not a hindrance to their learning English. And so that's why it's important when you do the home language survey, and Robin, you might want to chime in here, or anybody. It's really important to be clear that a registrar isn't, or somebody isn't looking at the home language survey and then either questioning it because the parent came in and they're a Spanish speaker or whatever. Do you want to say anything about that, Robin, before we go on?
Just, I do feel like I have some pretty stubborn people working for me at times. And so that goes back to my initial thing about the process. And the other thing is quite frankly, I am now sending my ESL coordinator with our parents during that registration process. And she's front loading that. She's telling the people that she's coming and that, you know, here are any of the things you need to know about this family. And she's copying the principal and myself. So I don't know. I felt like it wasn't a positive experience. And sometimes we also send our parent liaison with our ESL coordinator. So that's just a work in progress.
Yeah, but you've actually given us something to really support the way in which front office people are responsive to the needs of every parent, right, and every child, instead of, you know, whatever happens. They're used to doing a certain, you know, something a certain way, and they tend to do it the same way they've always done it, right? And that doesn't really work. So Katina, you have your hand up.
Yes, in regard to the topic you're on right now, we've run into the situation here at our school where I would probably say 60% of my staff all speak Spanish, and most of my parents are all Spanish speakers. And what we find is that when a new student comes, we don't advertise, it's usually through family, and we have the survey that they take. Many times they'll say English to everything, but they only speak to us in Spanish. And we realize when we've talked to them and kind of, you know, pushed it a little bit of saying, are you sure? Are you comfortable in English if we send you material at home? And they're like, oh no, but I don't want anybody to know that I don't speak English. And we're finding like, it's okay to tell us, because I want to make sure that you can read the information we send home. And so that stigma for individuals, there's still that sense of, I better say I speak English, even though I don't really know what you're saying. So when we do that, we actually just do it in the language the parent is most comfortable in. And that's how we have that, you know, the whole conversation. Because there have been times when I have had families say, yes, I speak English. And I say, no, actually you don't. And they're like, oh, thank goodness. Okay. And they kind of feel relief that I don't expect them to know English, that it's okay that they don't, and that we're going to accommodate them. But a lot of times those surveys, they'll answer English, but they're only on the Spanish side of the page kind of thing. And so those are things that clue us into, it's okay that you don't speak English. We'll teach you English if you want to come, because we have an adult program as well. But I just want to make sure that you understand all the communication we send home. And I think once they realize the purpose of the question, they feel more comfortable to answer, because up to that point, I think a lot of times, especially new families, are embarrassed to kind of, you know, let you know that, yeah, we really don't know it. But once they get comfortable, they're okay. But you do have to ask. You can't just, I guess, make assumptions. You really do have to investigate.
Yeah, I think that goes to this idea of a welcoming learning environment. I think I'll just tell you two other things. When I do focus groups with parents whose, you know, who students are English learners, students learning English, and it's in Spanish or whatever language that we're doing the translation in, this is a big issue. They don't really understand, and no one has ever helped them understand, you know, that having two languages and being biliterate is valued in Utah, or is it just valued for certain children? So the issue is, when I talk to parents, they have no idea about the biliteracy seal, as well as when I ask them about maintaining their family language. They want their children to understand their grandparents. They want their children to maintain their family language, but nobody talks to them about the value of that. If you have a family heritage language, you should be biliterate, right? That's really the point. So those are other aspects in relationship to the way in which we create an environment where bilingualism is a value, not just for native English speakers who want to be Spanish speakers or in the DLI program. And Dave and Granite and Wasatch have already done work to show that Spanish-speaking DLI students actually make more progress in learning English. Well, yeah, the research has shown that for the last, I don't know, 100 years, that if you're literate in your home language, it's much easier to attain other languages, right? So that's a really piece that's important. Bev, you're back, and there's some other things in the chat, but so these are just simple definitions, and then we'll go to the plan. Is there anything you can see, Bev?
Just a comment that, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure what C stands for, C Westerfield. I think that it is also important
Chris.
Chris, that there are some families that are illiterate, and that communication in a way they can understand may need to extend to phone calls or in-person meetings so they understand what's happening, which is very, very true.
Yeah. So if we actually believed what this policy says, I mean, this new bill actually says we value parent engagement. I mean, this is the whole point of this legislation. And so what does that mean? That means like all parents. And if we're touting that we're the international haven for dual language immersion, then is it dual language immersion just for native English speakers? I was asked to talk to the DLI people at their conference. And so their orientation is changing now and moving out into more diverse communities so that, and if anyone wants to work with me on this, with collaborating with DLI, because they're moving away from this very narrow view of how students are allowed to be in DLI. But let's not talk about that yet. But if you're interested, when I send it out to you, then you can email me. So the language access, so it says language access coordinator. Now this is, will be designated by an LEA and is responsible for updating this language access plan annually, which includes relevant training. So the goal is, so you have a policy, but it's really not working. So I actually really like this, right? Because oftentimes there's a policy and then people use it as simply black and white. And then it's never updated based on the context of who the children are and who the families are. It's all about, again, notifying parents, the rights of parents, and all the services for language assistance. This is pretty much a replica of federal law. I mean, it's pretty clear that it's very similar. And again, this is about determining the primary language. On the database and on our website, we have the languages spoken by the children, and then all the languages spoken by the parents. Brenda, do you have a question?
I don't have a question, but I just have something to share in terms of the things that we're talking about this morning. One of the things that I notice with our parents in San Juan is that they speak Navajo, but they may not read and write it. And so as we're communicating with parents and as we're creating our pamphlets and information packets, what we tend to do is record the information, and then put a QR code on the document, which allows them to play the recording. And then they don't have to worry about the written language and trying to decipher that.
Yeah, so I just want to tell everybody, Brenda, do you want to talk about the grant that you got about, maintaining the Navajo language, which is really exciting to me. And I'm just so grateful for the time I spent with you. If anybody wants to come with me to visit San Juan schools, you should just let me know.
Well, San Juan School District recently got awarded the Native Youth Community Project Grant, and it's really focused on increasing the number of students to get their Utah bilingual seal on their diplomas, but also to really enhance our heritage language program and all the language services that we're offering our students. So we're really excited about this new grant. It's going to bring a lot of support, and what I'm really excited about too is it's going to give ownership to the youth in terms of how they want to learn that language and provide choice. So part of that is youth leadership, having a leadership council. And so this is just like our third week of getting the grant. So there's a lot to do. So, but we're excited about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Brenda.
Mhm.
And again, just to remind you, the best math classes I've seen have actually been in San Juan. San Juan middle school teachers, amazing, and Bluff Elementary School math teachers, really incredible. So I'm not going to go through the whole, I'll just highlight some things. So the obligation to provide language services. This is the section that's important. So if you see, it's shall, which means it's an obligation. Consistent with this regulation, provide translation interpretation services to students and parents who require assistance in order to communicate effectively with their school. And then it says, now this piece is important, and Bev pointed this out to me, that the school could provide translation interpretation services beyond those outlined in this regulation. So here's what it says in relationship to interpretation based on the following activities. And you can see it's depending on the availability. It could be, because some people are now using Appropriate with, a phone app. So so it's broad enough for you to understand that it's really about communication, and it doesn't matter about the way in which you do that, which Brenda pointed out based on, Navajo being basically an oral language. So it says interpretation not limited to the following activities. So it's provided for, but not limited. So you have classroom activities, impromptu office calls, enrollment processes, IEP. I'm just going to say something about IEP process, and anyone can jump in here. There seems to be some strange separation between special education in LEAs and federal programs and EL. And I don't know why that is, but there's misidentification of students because they're not using a process on student study teams or using child find in relationship to what happens. And they think that, there's a disability, but it's really about language development. So I don't know if anybody wants to say anything about how critical the IEP process is and the family engagement, and then making language goals that are really immediately relevant to the assets and the supports provided for the student who might have dual language services. So an IEP as well as an English language development plan. Do you want to say something, Bev, about that? Because I know we talked about that previously.
There is so much to say about that. I'm just, it's like, where do you even begin? But yeah, it needs to be one of those things too, that we really work with our, when we talk about qualifications of our interpreters, it's really difficult sometimes to relay effectively the content when you're in an IEP meeting. And so we're trying to really work with specific sets of interpreters that we're using more and more and more for IEPs to make sure that the actual content is relayed correctly. But I'm not sure beyond that, that's a whole nother 2-hour meeting.
Yeah, well, and the division between, what happens in special ed and EL and federal program, I think there are, ongoing issues related to this idea about collective collaboration to benefit the student and accessing, everybody's expertise and not making it in somebody's bailiwick. I mean, it's not just about this.
Christelle, we have something in Box Elder that we're doing. So our students who are English learners, when they attend their IEP meetings, we have an ELO coordinator at every school, and we have them go to the IEP meeting and make sure that they are a part of it, so that when they are deciding what services they receive for their disability and their ELL services, that conversation is happening with their entire IEP team with an involved ELL coordinator. And so that you don't have this division of this IEP team has determined these services, EL requires this, and now there's this conflict of time and everything. Those decisions are made together all at the same time with all of the input from families, special education, and ELL all together. And we've seen that'd be really helpful to come up with the best placements for the students according to all of their needs. And so we don't see as much of the conflict that we saw in the past.
Yeah,
Hey,
thanks.
Christelle.
Yeah, Dave.
I
thanks.
think also with that, in large districts, it's about operating in silos. And what I've seen here in Granite is we've operated in silos. So your special ed, you know, have anything to do with English language learners, that's those people in that corner office that we send everything to. I was going to say something else, but this is being recorded. And so got to watch what I say, but, oh, let's send these people to that corner office over there because we're not going to deal with these kids anymore. It's now yours. And then the other piece, and so we're trying to mitigate that. We're trying to make sure that we have departments do what their job is, which means you know, help every student regardless of what they're coming to us with or without. And that's a big problem. The other big problem, Christelle, in a large district with regard to translation is budget, right? So when you have 20,000 multilingual learners, 120 languages, you're talking about this, what we're talking about right now, it comes down to budget. And so, you know, interesting how this always happens, that we have these kind of regulations put on us with no budget that comes with it, right? We have to find it from existing budgets. And that's the big deal about separation between departments like special ed and student services and English language, you know, ed equity department, those kinds of things, is it costs money. This isn't free. We have to, you know, hire people to do translations, which is great. And I'm all for it and want to see that happen. But I think those are the two pieces that works in where we're not, you know, working together as a full district.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I wanted to thank Jenny for talking about what Box Elder is doing. And Weber School District, they actually have a really great process that I've been trying to get them to share with us, which is amazing. And they do cross grade level teams, and their teams focus those meetings. Actually, they reorganize their schedule and they do it in such a way. And they actually end up determining, is this actually a language problem? And they do a lot of description about relationships between all the staff and everyone and the student for 2 years consecutively, in their relationships with families and home visits. So those things are important. And also to Dave's issue, yes, this is always about economics, but more than economics, it's about the way in which districts don't work in silos and they braid the kind of funding that would actually make a difference. Because you remember, the underlying assumption for interpretation is that Title III funds can't be used for it. And the reason it can't be used for it is because the issue around civil rights and OCR mandates that meaningful communication with parents who speak another language is a part of a civil right obligation. So even though this is a so-called unfunded mandate, it actually represents what the civil rights legislation has said for, you know, I don't know, 50 years. So it's a step in the right direction, and it's an opportunity for districts not to work in silos and to braid funding in relationship to what really matters. Like, for example, you know, at-risk funds, Title III, the reading funding. I mean, all these kinds of things, if districts work together in a different way, you know, could possibly mitigate the relationship between the requirements here and civil rights obligations. You know, I know that nobody wants to be under the Department of Justice and have another civil rights suit against, you know, another district in Utah. It just is, you know, doesn't really help. So these, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but again, this is directly from the legislation. It talks about all the processes. Now, this one, Beth and I have talked about translation requirements, registration or enrollment materials, including home language surveys. So these are things that should be translated based on the preference that families have, as Katina said, for the kinds of information that they want in a written form. And Brenda, I think, has so astutely said, if families aren't literate, then there's an easy way to actually record things so that it can be oral. So these are they're the lists from legislation. And it says any other guidance, including guidance on when oral interpretation is preferable to written translation to improve instruction and assistance. So this is kind of what Brenda is saying in relationship to oral interpretation, where written translation doesn't work for families that aren't literate. Do you want to say anything, Bev, about that?
Oh, I think you're right on.
Okay, so centrally produced critical communication. So this is coming down to the documents that are electronically communicated that have critical information. So they're pretty clear that this is about things like, registration, conduct, safety, discipline, special ed related services. We're not talking about field trips, and we're talking about, critical communication, and then translations, again, in a timely manner. I actually remember my first interaction with, I think it was Catholic Community Services, and a student had been left waiting because communication hadn't gone home in a way that the parent understood that it was a half day. And for some strange reason, this was a long time ago, they called Catholic Community Services and said, you need to come and pick up this kid or we're going to call the police. And I'm thinking, okay, well, that's really strange. Now we've gone from, that kind of reactive behavior like 6 or 7 years ago to something that doesn't do that. But that's really the whole point. The whole point is, how do we educate and support people? Because that's really our obligation. And all of these examples that you're giving us, I think, is really valuable because it's from what you're actually doing in the school, and it's not for your school, and it's not an abstraction. And so these are the specific critical documents that you can see: health, safety, legal, disciplinary, entitlement to public education, placement. So the critical communication, I think, is an added legal obligation that this policy protects you. So if you actually thought about this policy as protecting you and educating, everybody in the system to actually create the kind of learning environment that would make the most difference for each individual student and their family. So I think Bev and I have talked about asking another question. This isn't in the legislation, but it was in the model policy that IRC developed. And it was about a complaint procedure that we could insert here. So my question to you is, what does this model policy not include that must be included to support your LEA? So I'm going to stop sharing. So anyone, what do you think about doing something in there that has even at the end, it says, a complaint process to better support the way in which families are engaged in schools? We would just put that as a heading, and then you would decide what process you would use. That would be one thing. Or we could actually put some things in there that have been already developed by USBE in a standard operating procedure related to OCR. Speak now, forever hold your peace.
I like that because it gives us something to refer to rather than trying to create something that might get us into trouble. And it's easy to do. Getting into trouble is easy these days. So if you have something that can provide reference, that would be excellent.
Floyd, I like the way you think, and I really appreciate it, because this is really about protecting the work that we're trying to do in the process of doing it, instead of getting it all wrong, right? And then having legal issues or, OCR issues or Department of Justice issues, or we don't want that. So everything we try to do is to mitigate the ways in which we're doing our, the problems that we would have from keeping us doing our best work. We want to do our best work for children and families, right? That's Utah. I mean, it's pretty clear since I've been here. So thanks, Floyd. Anyone else about putting just something in so that you all could work on it and make sure that you understand what families can do to make sure that their needs are being met?
Christelle, I apologize for hogging the space here for a minute, but
No, it's
I
fine.
think what you're saying is that there would be some boilerplate language. Is that what I'm hearing? And then
Yeah.
we could kind of refine that boilerplate so that it would
Right.
work for our district.
That's right. For me, the biggest thing is nothing ever changes behavior or works if it's so mandated that the districts can't adapt it to the resources and the processes that they already have in place. This is what Dave is talking about in relationship to the resources and the people that he has in place. The things that Robin has mentioned in relationship to being a smaller district, and all the processes that Bev is trying to do in Canyons, which is a much larger district. And this is the way we learn with and from each other. Because if we're all doing this work and we're isolated, it doesn't really help anybody. So you're absolutely right, Floyd. Anyone else? I see Salt Lake here. So Monty, do you want to say anything? And I see, Claudia from Ogden. So anything that you want to say about anything that's missing from the actual model policy that would be important for guidance for you all?
Can I just say something? I know it's not my turn, but we are finding our school very teensy compared to the big districts, very teensy. But what we find a lot is that our parents, we become their source of all information as the school. Let me give you an example. A while ago, on a Sunday, a small child, a first grader, got mad at mom and took off. Mom didn't know what to do, so she calls me. I'm the principal of the school. I'm at church. And she's like, what do I do? What do I do? And I'm like, you need to call the police. You need to, I don't live where you live. I don't know what's going on. You need to call the police. But in the sense of a lot of our families just don't have connections to know what to do next, right? If something happens in their family. So we at our school are very family oriented. So we have for the babies and the preschool, and then the elementary grades, and then for the adult education. But I think sometimes what we're lacking is more support for the whole group. And sometimes all that they have are connections through schools. And could there be a way, or is there a way for families to call maybe schools and be directed to somebody else? Or could there be a team or somehow, how do we support these families around? I mean, how do you guys do it? I just end up talking to people all the time, on the weekends, after hours, whenever families are in need, they tend to call, one of us, and I end up on the phone with somebody because they end up calling me. So out of curiosity, how do we support families better than just calling the principal?
Okay, so I'll just say one thing, and if anybody wants to add this, what Granite has done and Salt Lake has done, they have a community, and even though they're larger districts, but Salt Lake isn't as large as Granite, they have community centers where the whole focus is connecting families to community-based organizations, right? So the question is, even things like, if you have these issues, who can you call? I mean, that could be one way that you do a frequently asked question to support families. So I don't know, Bev or anyone else, do you have any other ideas about, and I see Esther and she has a charter school and has done amazing work and is now actually approved for a competency-based ESL endorsement. But I don't want to put you on the spot, Esther, but it's the issue about, community schools being the source for families to get the assistance that they need.
And I'm not complaining. I'm not saying that that's not okay. I just feel like it's inadequate. I'm just not enough.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
There has to be something as, wider than just somebody like me.
Well, one thing again would be, to meet with Dave and Salt Lake people, because their community learning centers do all that, but it's in a school. It's based near a school.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, Christelle, I think an easy thing to do, not easy, I don't want to say easy, but we're trying to get our family centers to do this, to try and find parents within that community who could be resources to other parents, right? And so now we sometimes think that schools have to answer all the questions, have to do everything for everyone, when really there are parents in your community who, if you just trained a little bit and told them, hey, and their numbers, and they were willing to give out their numbers and have people call, that's a really sustained effort on what to do, right? And have others that they could call. And those are people that aren't part of the school. They can talk naturally and open with them and be real good resources. And that's kind of where we're trying to get to, even with our, as Gasak is on here, she's one of our refugee liaisons. We're trying to get our parents to come together as groups to help each other. That's just one way, an idea.
Yeah, Dave, thanks. And Dina has her hand up, and she's and these are really good examples. Some of the best leaders in the community obviously are parents. And
yeah, so I mean, as I think Esther's been listening, but I don't know that she was here to answer your question, but I was just gonna say the same thing. We have a partnership with 4-H USU. And I feel like a lot of those things, we have a community partnership person. I can't remember their exact title. They're not called a liaison, but they help with a lot of those things. We have, adult ESL classes and a lot of different things, family activities, family night activities, a lot of things where we bring in translators and just try to educate adults about a lot of the educational system, how to read with their kids, how to help them with their homework. Also, getting help with electricity, getting help with heat, just different things like that that sometimes happen that they don't know how to do. But we do that with our partnership through 4-H a lot. So our school is kind of the community building, and that has been kind of our answer to a lot of those. So a lot of times when we get those calls, we send them to that 4-H person, and they really help, and that's funded through USU. And like last night we had a literacy night at the Kearns campus. Tonight we're having one at the Magna campus, and we feed them, and they're lots of translations, lots of things in multiple languages, lots of books, lots of everything. And I think that it takes the pressure off of us. I mean, we still get those calls, but then we know how to move them out to another person that can be more helpful.
Thanks, Dina. And I actually see a hand, and I think, hope I don't mispronounce your name.
My name is Gasad. I work at the Granite School District. Yeah. So I want to say that for our refugee family, the first thing they come. So I'm talking as a refugee liaison, and I'm also came as a refugee 13 years ago. So when the family came to the country, and when we finished their registration, we do some family meeting. We give them all the information that they need about the schools and how we can help them, like how it's just the basic thing, how they can request interpreter, how they need all the resource that they need as the let's say take a day off for their students. So we have all that package for the family, prepare just like to say survivor things. for their kids and the family too.
Thank you so much for your contributions. There's
Yeah.
in the chat now, I'm looking at the chat. So Bev, you don't have to do it. Thank you for doing that. This is from Monty, and he's new in his position at Salt Lake. And he's uncovering some of the same hurdles and issues in their in Salt Lake district. And he's just appreciating the fact that he's learning from everybody, and this is a good forum to actually learn with each other. I feel like we've, created a really powerful learning community for the ALS directors. And we've added lots of other people who, are also included. So I think so I'm going to tell you what I think our next steps are. So when I email the recording out to you, I'll update the legislation webpage as well. And then we'll work on kind of a template or just suggestions related for a complaint process. It might be in the guidance section, Bev. I don't know. We have to think about it, right? Instead of a separate one, I think. And then we would leave it up to you, because again, to go back to what Dave has said and other people, it's about the resources and the systems and processes that you have in place to mitigate kind of departments working in silos, so you can braid not only funding, but the efforts that you're doing, whether it's special ed or curriculum, because sometimes curriculum is very, very separate, and instructional coach is very separate from Title III or federal programs or anything like that. So I think that's the piece that's really important. Would anyone like to say, so the follow-up will be sending this out to you, sending the version of the other bill. And I think maybe I should do like a version of this bill that you would understand, not just the model policy, but you would actually understand the bill, So the summaries of the two bills, I have one summary of 320. I always get these bills mixed up. It's 230. Is it 230? I don't know. Anyway, those two bills, and then an opportunity with kind of stated goals around what a subcommittee would be working on. And, we might meet again in November, and this would be after the deadline for the interim education report that's supposed to be sent to them, and issues related to purchasing and the feedback that we can actually give Annie's here. So it's, HB 230 and then HB 302. So the 230 is the one about enrollment, and the 302 is the one that we just got with the model policy. So any other comments or questions before we call it? And I really apologize for the confusion in starting the meeting. I'm really on a small laptop now, and my other computer wasn't working. And so I apologize for that. Anything else that you want from me? You realize I'm at your service. You should take advantage of me while I'm still here.
Can I just say thank you for all the help you've given us already, Christelle. You've been terrific. So I just want to compliment you and thank you for your help and assistance. You've been great.
Well, thanks, Floyd. So I'll end with one last thing. A charter school asked the principal, and I didn't know her from Salt Lake, but she had been in Salt Lake and at Wasatch School. And she invited me to come and just walk with her and use the USB observation tool to see how scaffolded instruction and what the promising practices were in her school already, so she could disseminate it. And it was in the morning, and we did that, and I did a one-pager. It's not official, like it wasn't an official USBE Title III report or anything like that. We had a great conversation and identified quite a few promising practices in mathematics and science, social studies, a few in English language arts, where using the comma was actually the most fun I've ever had in any class related to understanding the comma. She was really wonderful. So you just let me know if you ever want to visit one of your schools, and it's not official, but we would use the actual USBE tool, and then we would sit down and have a conversation. And then I would identify the most promising practices based on Hattie and research, and then just send you a one-pager. So you just let me know. I mean, you know, that makes my day when I'm interviewing kids and, you know, visiting schools. So I'm totally open to that. Okay, anything else before we leave? So everybody's saying thank you for the informative meeting. Okay, so we're all good.